I never thought my marriage would come to this. 14 years together, a daughter we both adored, and a life built on trust, or so I believed. It all started with a simple notification, one that set everything in motion. It was late on a Tuesday night. My wife, Melissa, was in bed scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. I was getting ready to turn off the lights when I noticed her tense up for a split second, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Who's texting you this late?" I asked casually, not thinking much of it. "Oh, just Jenny," she replied too quickly, her voice light but forced. "She's asking about plans for the weekend." I nodded, pretending to believe her, but something about her body language threw me off. Melissa wasn't one to act shifty, and she usually didn't care if I glanced at her phone. Tonight, though, she angled the screen away from me, almost defensively. A few moments later, as she got up to brush her teeth, I caught a glimpse of her phone on the nightstand. The screen had dimmed, but not before I saw the name on the notification. It wasn't Jenny. The name read Aiden99, followed by a laughing emoji. My chest tightened. Who the hell was Aiden99? I stared at the phone for a moment, debating whether to pick it up. No, I told myself. Stay calm. Don't jump to conclusions. But that tiny spark of doubt had already ignited something deep within me. Melissa returned, picked up her phone, and slipped it into her pocket without another word. "I'm exhausted," she said, sliding under the covers. "Good night, babe." "Good night," I murmured, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. The next morning, while Melissa was in the shower, I made my move. Her phone sat on the counter, unguarded. My hands trembled as I unlocked it using her predictable password, our anniversary date. I quickly navigated to her Instagram. My stomach churned as I saw what she had been hiding. Her DMs were full of conversations with men I didn't recognize. Some were harmless enough. Old coworkers, acquaintances, but then there were the others. The ones that made my blood run cold. Young men, barely out of their teens, judging by their profiles. They flirted openly, sending her compliments, heart emojis, and even shirtless selfies. And Melissa? She was responding, flirting back, laughing at their jokes. The thread with Aiden99 was the worst. He looked no older than 19, maybe 20. In their chat, she had complimented his youthful energy and even suggested they meet up for coffee. I closed the app and stepped back, my hands shaking. My mind raced with questions. Why? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, who was this woman lying next to me every night? I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I began observing. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to her behavior. Melissa had always been active on social media, but now I noticed how often she had her phone in her hand. She'd smile at the screen, her thumbs moving quickly, and then lock it the moment I entered the room. Friday evening, she claimed she was going to her book club meeting. She dressed casually, but I noticed she spent extra time on her hair and makeup. Her lipstick was a bold red I hadn't seen her wear in months. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile as she grabbed her purse. "It might run late." I nodded, playing along. "Have fun." The moment she walked out the door, I grabbed my keys and followed her. Staying far enough behind so she wouldn't notice, I trailed her car through the dimly lit streets of our suburban neighborhood. She didn't head toward the usual book club location at the library. Instead, she drove to a nearby cafe, one we rarely visited. Parking discreetly across the street, I watched as Melissa entered. A few minutes later, a young man joined her. A boy, really? My heart sank as I realized it was Aiden99 from the Instagram messages. He looked even younger in person. From my car, I watched as they sat by the window, laughing and leaning in close. My vision blurred with anger and disbelief, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to be smart about this. Rash decisions wouldn't get me the answers, or the revenge I needed. By the time Melissa came home that night, I was back in bed, pretending to be asleep. She slipped under the covers, her perfume lingering in the air. I clenched my fists under the blanket, my mind spinning with plans. She thought I was clueless. She thought she could live a double life without consequences. But Melissa didn't know who she was dealing with. If she wanted to play games, I'd show her I was better at them. Revenge was coming. The morning after Melissa's so-called book club meeting, I couldn't stop replaying the image of her and that kid in the cafe. The way she smiled at him, leaned forward to touch his hand. It wasn't just flirtation. It was calculated, intentional. But I wasn't about to jump to conclusions without evidence. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Melissa moved around the kitchen that morning, humming to herself, like she didn't have a care in the world. I watched her closely, sipping my coffee, my mind already forming a plan. "Did you have fun last night?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Yeah, it was nice," she replied, not looking up from her plate of scrambled eggs. "The girls and I talked about the new book we're reading. You'd probably hate it. It's one of those romantic dramas." I nodded, hiding the bitter taste in my mouth. She lied so easily. "Glad you enjoyed it," I said, forcing a smile. "You deserve some time to yourself." As soon as she left for work, I got to work myself. First, I checked the calendar app on her iPad, which she rarely used but always kept synced with her phone. Sure enough, the book club event was nowhere to be found. Next, I logged into her Instagram again, this time downloading screenshots of her conversations with Aiden99 and a few other young men. One stood out, a chat with a guy named Jason Fernie, who had just turned 18, according to his bio. In the messages, Melissa complimented his maturity and suggested they grab a drink sometime. I clenched my jaw as I scrolled further. Melissa wasn't just flirting. She was building a network of barely legal boys who clearly thought they'd landed some older, sophisticated woman. The thought made my stomach churn. By noon, I had enough to convince myself this wasn't a one-off mistake. This was a pattern, but I needed more. Something irrefutable. Something that could bring her whole fantasy world crashing down. That's when I decided to track her movements. I bought a GPS tracker online and spent the next few hours figuring out how to attach it discreetly to her car. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I reminded myself why this was necessary. Melissa wasn't just betraying me. She was putting our family, our daughter, at risk with her reckless behavior. Later that week, I installed the tracker while Melissa was in the shower. My heart pounded as I crouched next to her car in the garage, screwing the small device into place beneath the rear bumper. If she caught me, I had no idea what I'd say. But she didn't. For the next few days, I monitored her routes whenever she claimed she was going to work or running errands. Most of the time, she went exactly where she said she would. But Friday night was different. Melissa told me she was heading to the gym for her regular yoga class. That wasn't unusual. She'd been going to yoga for years, though lately, her sessions seemed to run longer than before. Using the GPS app on my phone, I watched as her car drove right past the gym and into a residential area on the other side of town. My pulse quickened as the dot on the map stopped moving, settling in front of a house. I waited a few minutes, then followed. By the time I arrived, her car was parked outside a small, unassuming home. A light was on in the living room, and through the window, I saw her silhouette, laughing, tossing her hair. She wasn't alone. A young man stepped into view, holding 2 glasses of what looked like wine. He handed one to her, and they clinked glasses, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wanted to storm into that house, drag her out, and demand answers. But I held myself back. This wasn't the time to blow up. I needed to gather more evidence, to plan my next move carefully. The next day, I decided to test her. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned, "Hey, I've been thinking of joining you for yoga. I could use the exercise." Melissa froze for a split second, her fork hovering over her plate. Then she laughed, a little too loudly. "Oh, you'd hate it," she said. "It's not your kind of workout, lots of meditation and stretching. But thanks for offering." I smiled. "Maybe I'll try it sometime. You've been so committed to it lately. Must be a great class." She shrugged and changed the subject. But that hesitation, that flicker of panic in her eyes, it told me everything I needed to know. That evening, when she was out, I dug deeper. Using the GPS history from her car, I traced her movements over the past few weeks. Patterns emerged, visits to the same house, the same cafe, the same park. One address in particular stood out. It was a nearby motel, the kind where people go to avoid being seen. She'd been there twice in the past month, both times during her yoga nights. The pieces were falling into place. Melissa had created an elaborate web of lies, thinking I'd never notice. But she underestimated me. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a betrayal of everything we'd built together. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Revenge wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a mission. Melissa thought she was clever. She had no idea how closely I was watching her, how every move she made was feeding my plan. I told myself to stay calm, to act as though nothing had changed, even as my heart boiled with anger every time I saw her smile at our daughter or kiss me goodnight. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my little girl, Grace. Melissa's lies weren't just breaking our marriage. They were tainting the safe, stable home we'd built for Grace. And I wasn't going to let that stand. I decided it was time to take things to the next level. I'd been following Melissa's movements, tracking her car, and combing through her social media, but I needed concrete evidence, something I could hold up and say, this is who she's become. I borrowed a high-definition camera from a buddy at work. It wasn't a spy camera exactly, but it could zoom in from a considerable distance and capture crystal-clear video. That Friday, when Melissa left for another one of her yoga sessions, I followed her again. As expected, she drove straight past the gym and headed for that same residential house I'd seen her at before. This time, I parked farther away and set up the camera, aiming it at the living room window. Through the lens, I saw her sitting on the couch with the same young man, Jason. She was laughing, leaning in close, her hand on his knee. My stomach churned as I hit record. Watching my wife behave this way, so casual, so unashamed, was like a dagger to my chest. But I didn't stop. I needed this proof, no matter how much it hurt. After an hour, Jason walked her to her car. I captured the whole exchange. The hug that lingered a little too long, the way his hand brushed her lower back. And then, just as she got into her car, she leaned out the window and kissed him on the cheek. I clenched my fists, but I didn't move. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. Not yet. The next day, I went through her phone again while she was in the shower. My hands still shook when I did this. I hated being the guy who snooped, but I reminded myself why I was doing it. I found another message thread, this one with Aiden 99. They were planning to meet that weekend at a park near downtown. It was all there in black and white. Aiden, you're not gonna back out, are you? Melissa, of course not. I wouldn't miss seeing you, cutie. Aiden, cool. 3 p.m. at Willow Creek Park. Melissa, perfect. I'll bring something fun to drink, winking-faced. I felt ball rise in my throat. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. That weekend, I staked out the park before Melissa even left the house. I positioned myself on a bench under a tree, dressed inconspicuously, my camera hidden in a messenger bag. Right on time, Melissa arrived. She parked her car and strolled toward the benches with a picnic basket in hand. Aiden showed up minutes later, wearing a hoodie and ripped jeans. They sat together under a tree, laughing like old friends. Melissa opened the basket and pulled out a bottle of wine. She poured 2 plastic cups, handed one to Aiden, and clinked it against her own. It was sickening to watch. This boy was barely older than Grace, and Melissa was sitting there, acting like she was some carefree college girl. I filmed everything. Their laughter, the way she touched his arm, the way he leaned in close like he was trying to kiss her. That evening, when Melissa came home, I pretended everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, smiled at Grace, and went on about how relaxing her yoga session had been. But I could see it in her eyes. The thrill of whatever she'd just done still lingered there. And that was all I needed to remind myself. She thought she'd gotten away with it. The next step in my plan was to get someone else involved. I contacted a private investigator I'd found online, a guy named Paul who specialized in uncovering infidelity. I handed him the videos, the screenshots, and the GPS logs I'd been collecting for weeks. I don't just want proof, I told him. I want to bury her with this. Paul raised an eyebrow but nodded. You're serious about this, huh? Dead serious. Paul promised results within a week. Meanwhile, I kept up the charade at home, pretending everything was fine. Melissa didn't suspect a thing. If anything, she seemed more relaxed, like she was finally settling into this double life she'd created. But I wasn't going to let her live it for much longer. One night, While she was asleep, I reviewed the footage I'd collected so far. Watching it again was painful, but it also fueled my resolve. Every laugh, every touch, every lie she told to cover her tracks. It was all ammunition. And soon, I'd use it to bring her entire world crashing down. I was ready to strike. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, every detail meticulously documented. The lies, the secret meetings, the messages. Melissa thought she was untouchable, but she was about to learn how wrong she was. That week, Paul, the private investigator, came through. He handed me a folder thicker than I expected, filled with photos, logs, and transcriptions of conversations. She's not just meeting one guy, Paul said, his face grim. She's juggling multiple. And some of them are way younger than you think. I opened the folder and felt my stomach twist. There were photographs of Melissa meeting not just Aiden and Jason, but two others. One of them couldn't have been older than 16. I froze, staring at the image of my wife, laughing with a boy who looked like he should still be in high school. Are you sure about this? I asked Paul, my voice barely above a whisper. Unfortunately, yes, Paul said. And it gets worse. He pulled out a printout from an online chat. It was from a private messaging app one hadn't known Melissa was using. The messages were explicit, far worse than anything I'd seen before. And then, there it was, a screenshot of a message Melissa had sent to one of these boys. Melissa, don't tell anyone about us. This has to stay between you and me, okay? My hands shook as I read the words. This wasn't just infidelity. This was something far more sinister. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What Melissa was doing wasn't just a betrayal. It was dangerous, reckless, and illegal. By morning, my anger had turned to cold resolve. If she thought she could live this double life and walk away unscathed, she was about to learn otherwise. The following weekend, Melissa told me she had a work meeting on Saturday afternoon. I already knew what that meant. I waited for her to leave, then checked the GPS tracker. Sure enough, she was headed back to that same residential house where she'd been meeting Jason. I followed her, parking down the street, and watched as she entered the house. I waited about 30 minutes before deciding to act. This time, I wasn't just collecting evidence. This time, I wanted her to know I was watching. I approached the house, my camera ready, and knocked on the door. A few moments later, it opened. Jason stood there, his face pale as he saw me. "Who are you?" he stammered, clearly caught off guard. "I'm Melissa's husband," I said, my voice calm but icy. "Is she here?" Jason froze, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I didn't wait for an answer. I pushed past him into the living room, where Melissa was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine. Her face drained of color the moment she saw me. "Jack? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, holding up the camera, "but I think we both know the answer." For a moment, Melissa looked like she might try to deny everything. But then Jason blurted out, "I told you this was a bad idea," and stormed out of the room. Melissa buried her face in her hands. "Jack, I can explain." "Don't," I snapped. "You've done enough." I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A laptop sitting on the coffee table, its screen still on. Without thinking, I grabbed it and opened it. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't just messages. There were folders filled with photos and videos Melissa had exchanged with these boys. My wife hadn't just been flirting. She'd been documenting everything. Melissa tried to grab the laptop, but I pulled it away. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Jack, please. Don't lie to me, Melissa. You've been keeping secrets for weeks, maybe months. Is this what you've been doing behind my back?" She broke down sobbing, but her tears didn't move me. If anything, they only fueled my anger. That night, I went through the laptop in detail, uncovering more than I'd ever wanted to know. The evidence was damning, enough to destroy her reputation, her career, and possibly even her freedom. But the most shocking discovery came when I found a hidden folder labeled Plan B. Inside were messages between Melissa and another man. Not one of the boys, but someone older, someone I hadn't seen before. The messages revealed that Melissa had been planning to leave me and take Grace with her. She'd even started looking at apartments in another state. The man, who called himself Rick, had been encouraging her, promising to help her start fresh. Rick, Jack's too blind to notice. You'll be out of there before he even realizes what's happening. Melissa, I know. I just need a few more weeks to get everything in place. My chest tightened. She wasn't just betraying me. She was trying to rip my daughter away from me, to take her into this twisted, deceitful world she created. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war. I spent the next few days finalizing my plan. The evidence I had was enough to take her down completely, and I intended to use it. But first, I needed to confront her one last time, to make her realize just how far she'd fallen. When Melissa came home that night, she found me sitting in the living room, the folder of evidence spread out on the coffee table. Her face went pale as she realized what was happening. Sit down, I said coldly. Jack, I can explain. Sit down. She obeyed, tears already forming in her eyes. You thought you could lie to me, betray me, and tear our family apart without consequences, I said, my voice steady. But you were wrong. I know everything, Melissa. And now, it's your turn to face the truth. Melissa sat across from me on the couch, her hands trembling as I slid the folder toward her. The weight of her lies was finally beginning to crush her. Go on, I said, my voice cold and sharp. Take a look. It's all there. The boys, the messages, the photos, the plans to leave me and take Grace. Her eyes darted to the folder, but she didn't open it. Instead, she looked up at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jack, please. I can explain. Explain what? I interrupted, my voice rising. Explain how you've been sneaking around with teenage boys while pretending to be a devoted wife and mother? Explain how you plan to rip Grace away from her home and her father to start some twisted new life with your little boy toy and your Plan B partner. Her lips quivered, but she said nothing. That's what I thought, I said, leaning back. You can't explain it, Melissa, because there is no excuse for what you've done. I let the silence stretch out, watching as she squirmed. Part of me wanted to yell, to scream, to tell her exactly how much she had destroyed. But another part of me, colder, more calculated, wanted her to feel every ounce of shame and guilt without giving her the chance to manipulate the situation. You thought you were clever, I continued, but I'm better at this than you. I've been watching you for weeks, Melissa. Every lie, every secret meeting, every disgusting little message. I've seen it all. And now it's over. She finally broke, sobbing into her hands. Jack, I wasn't thinking clearly. I made a mistake, but I swear it wasn't serious. I was just lonely. Lonely? I repeated, laughing bitterly. That's your excuse? You had a husband who loved you, a daughter who adored you, and you threw it all away because you were lonely? Her sobs grew louder, but I felt nothing. You're not sorry for what you did, I said. You're sorry you got caught. The next morning, I put my plan into action. I filed for divorce and sent everything I had to my lawyer. The screenshots, the videos, the GPS logs, even the transcripts of her conversations with those boys and with Rick. She's not just a cheater, I told my lawyer. She's dangerous. I want full custody of Grace, and I don't want Melissa anywhere near her. He nodded. With the evidence you've given me, I don't think that will be a problem. That afternoon, I paid a visit to Jason, the boy I'd seen with Melissa at the residential house. He looked like a deer caught in headlights when he opened the door and saw me standing there. I'm not here to hurt you, I said quickly, holding up my hands. But we need to talk. Jason hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. I know about you and Melissa, I said, getting straight to the point. And I know you're not the only one. I'm not interested in ruining your life, but I need you to tell me everything. At first, he denied it. But when I showed him the photos and messages I'd collected, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She said she was unhappy, he admitted. She made it sound like her husband was this controlling monster and that she needed someone to talk to. I didn't know she was lying. She's been lying to everyone, I interrupted. And now, I need your help to make sure she doesn't get away with it. Jason told me everything. How Melissa had met him through a mutual friend, how she charmed him with promises and flattery, and how she convinced him to keep their meetings a secret. He also revealed something I hadn't expected. She had been using him to recruit other boys into her sick little circle. That was the final piece of the puzzle. Melissa wasn't just selfish and reckless. She was manipulative and dangerous. The next day, I confronted Rick, the older man Melissa had been planning her escape with. He was harder to track down, but Paul, the PI, had found his address. When I showed up at his office, he looked shocked to see me. "Jack, right?" he said, forcing a smile. "Melissa's husband?" "That's right," I said, stepping closer. "And I know everything." His smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I snapped, pulling out my phone and showing him the messages. "You've been helping my wife plan to leave me and kidnap my daughter. You've been feeding her lies and encouraging her behavior." Rick's face turned pale. "Look, I didn't know the full extent of it, okay? I thought she just needed a fresh start." "Save it," I said coldly. "If you don't want me dragging you into court alongside her, you'll stay out of my family's life for good. Do you understand me?" He nodded quickly, his hands shaking. By the end of the week, everything was in place. I had the divorce papers ready, full custody of Grace nearly secured, and a restraining order in motion to keep Melissa away from our daughter. But I wasn't finished yet. I gathered Melissa's family and closest friends, along with a few of Grace's teachers and our mutual acquaintances, and invited them over for a family meeting. Melissa had no idea what was coming. When she arrived and saw everyone gathered, her face went pale. "Jack, what's going on?" I stepped forward, holding up the folder of evidence. "This is what's going on. It's time everyone knew the truth about who you really are." For the next hour, I laid everything out. The messages, the photos, the lies. Melissa tried to interrupt, to deny, to cry her way out of it, but no one believed her. Her family was horrified, her friends disgusted, and by the end of it, she was left sitting alone, humiliated and defeated. "You thought you could tear this family apart and get away with it," I said as I stood over her. "But now, everyone knows who you are. You're done, Melissa." Melissa's tears filled the silence in the room as I dropped the folder of evidence onto the coffee table for everyone to see. Her mother buried her face in her hands, shaking her head in disbelief, while her sister muttered something under her breath about being ashamed to share the same last name. Melissa stammered, trying to salvage the wreckage. "Jack, please. You don't understand. It's not what it looks like." "Not what it looks like?" I shot back, my voice cutting through her sobs. "Melissa, I have photos, videos, messages, every disgusting detail. What part of this isn't exactly what it looks like?" Her father, a stern man who rarely raised his voice, finally spoke. "Melissa, is this true?" he asked, his tone low but full of disappointment. She hesitated, looking around the room as if searching for an ally, but no one met her gaze. I made mistakes," she admitted quietly. "Mistakes?" I laughed bitterly. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or losing your keys. What you've done is destroy lives, Melissa. You've put Grace at risk, lied to your family, and dragged our marriage through the mud for what? For this." I held up one of the screenshots, a particularly damning exchange with Jason. She buried her face in her hands, unable to answer. As the tension in the room reached its peak, the doorbell rang. Everyone froze. "Were you expecting someone?" her sister asked, narrowing her eyes at Melissa. "No," I said, my stomach tightening. I walked to the door and opened it to find Rick standing on the porch, looking just as uncomfortable as I felt. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, stepping outside and shutting the door behind me. Rick held up his hands defensively. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly. "But there's something you need to know." I crossed my arms, glaring at him. "You've got 5 seconds to explain before I call the cops," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Melissa didn't tell you the whole story," he said. "She's been lying to me too. I thought she just wanted a fresh start, but it turns out she's been using me, and everyone else. There's another man." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Another man? After everything I'd uncovered, there was still more? Rick handed me his phone, showing me messages between Melissa and someone named Liam. The conversations were similar to the ones she'd had with Jason and Aiden, but they were far more detailed. She wasn't just flirting with Liam. She was planning a future with him. She told him she'd move in with him once the divorce was finalized, Rick said, his voice filled with bitterness, and that he'd be a better father figure to Grace than you ever were. My blood ran cold. Where is he? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Rick hesitated. I don't know exactly, but I think he's coming here. She texted me earlier, saying she'd need my help to pack her things tonight. I didn't realize why until now. I stormed back inside, my heart pounding in my chest. Melissa looked up, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the expression on my face. Who's Liam? I demanded. She flinched, her gaze darting around the room. Jack, don't you dare lie to me again. I roared. I know everything, Melissa. Rick just showed me the messages. You were planning to run off with him, weren't you? The room erupted into chaos as her family began shouting questions, demanding answers. Melissa broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, but her tears no longer had any effect on me. Not 10 minutes later, there was another knock at the door. I didn't wait for Melissa to answer it. I threw the door open and came face to face with Liam. He was younger than I expected, barely in his 20s, with a smug grin that evaporated the moment he saw me. You must be Jack, he said nervously, stepping back as I advanced on him. You have 2 seconds to get off my property. I snarled, my fists clenched. Jack, wait, Melissa cried, rushing to the door. It's not what you think. I turned to her, my voice low and full of venom. Don't say another word. Liam stammered something about not wanting trouble, but I didn't care. You're messing with the wrong family, I said coldly. Leave now, or I'll make sure you regret ever meeting her. He didn't need to be told twice. He bolted to his car and sped off, leaving a trail of dust behind him. When I turned back to Melissa, she looked utterly broken. Her family stared at her with a mixture of shock and disgust, and even Grace, who had come downstairs during the commotion, looked at her mother like she was a stranger. Jack, I'm sorry, Melissa whispered, her voice trembling. Please, we can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head. It's too late, Melissa. You've lied too many times, and you've dragged our daughter into your mess. You don't get to fix this. Over the next few days, the fallout was swift and brutal. Melissa's family cut ties with her, her friends abandoned her, and Grace made it clear she wanted nothing to do with her mother. Meanwhile, I finalized the divorce and secured full custody of Grace. The judge didn't even hesitate after seeing the evidence I presented. Melissa's downfall was complete, but it wasn't just about punishing her. It was about rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. Grace and I began to heal, our bond stronger than ever. And Melissa? She was left with nothing but the wreckage of the life she had so carelessly thrown away. The day the divorce was finalized, I stood in the courthouse hallway with Grace by my side. She squeezed my hand tightly, her presence grounding me as the judge's decision echoed in my mind. Full custody granted to the father. Melissa wasn't even in the courtroom. She had spiraled into complete isolation after the truth came out, abandoned by everyone she thought would stand by her. Her parents refused to speak to her. Even her so-called friends wanted nothing to do with her once they learned the extent of her lies. Grace looked up at me, her eyes filled with relief. Is it really over, Dad? It's over, I said, kneeling to her level. It's just you and me now, kiddo. We're going to be okay. For the first time in what felt like years, I saw her smile, a real, genuine smile. While Melissa had been hiding away, I had one last move to make. She thought she could escape accountability by retreating into the shadows, but I wasn't going to let her get off that easy. I met with Paul, the private investigator, one final time. The evidence we've gathered. It's time to go public, I said, sliding the thick folder across his desk. Paul hesitated. You sure about this? It could ruin her completely. That's the idea, I said, my voice cold. She didn't hesitate to ruin our lives. Now, it's her turn to feel the consequences. Within days, the evidence was delivered to the right people. Melissa's employer, local authorities, and even a few key figures in her social circle. The photos, messages, and records of her actions were impossible to ignore. Her employer fired her immediately, citing a violation of their ethics policy. The authorities launched an investigation into her interactions with the underage boys she had been messaging. And her reputation? It was obliterated. Melissa called me a week later, her voice barely recognizable. She sounded broken, defeated, like a shadow of the confident, manipulative woman she had once been. "Jack, please," she begged. "I need your help. I don't have anyone else." I gripped the phone tightly, anger bubbling under the surface. "You had everything, Melissa. A family, a home, a daughter who adored you. And you threw it all away." "I know," she sobbed. "I messed up. I didn't know what I was doing. That's not my problem anymore," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choices, and now you get to live with them. Goodbye, Melissa." I hung up, blocking her number for good. Grace and I settled into a new rhythm, free from the chaos Melissa had brought into our lives. I found joy in the little things again, cooking breakfast together, helping her with homework, cheering her on at her soccer games. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Grace turned to me and said, "I'm glad it's just us now, Dad. I don't miss her anymore." I pulled her into a hug, my heart swelling with both pride and sadness. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Months later, I heard through the grapevine that Melissa had moved out of state. She was living in a tiny apartment, working a dead-end job, and struggling to rebuild the life she had destroyed. The investigation into her actions with the underage boys was still ongoing, and it was clear she wasn't going to escape unscathed. But none of that mattered to me anymore. My focus was on Grace and the future we were building together. As I watched her chase fireflies in the backyard one summer evening, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Melissa may have tried to break us, but in the end, she only made us stronger. I had one. And Melissa? She would spend the rest of her life remembering the love she had lost and paying for the choices she had made.